I have a bone to pick with the recent God of War reboot. Not with the reboot itself. Not that I think it's a bad game. I think it is very much a good game, but at the back of my head there is a nagging feeling that just won't stop thinking about the statements made around its release, that it was a bold departure for the series and that the developers didn't know if the fans would like it, as if it was taking a big bold risk. In reality, it was the opposite. Most of the original elements from God of War were stripped in favor of more generic mechanics, making it into what could be seen at first as just The Last of Us but with a boomerang axe. And you know what, I think a lot of people could really dig that, but rebooting a product into something more mainstream and getting praise for that is just absolutely ridiculous. Enter Yakuza Like a Dragon, a game with actual dragon balls of courage who didn't just change mechanics, but changed the entire genre from a single character 3D brawler to a turn-based, party-based JRPG after more than 10 installments of brawling. Now, that is a true curveball if I've ever seen one, changing not only genres, but from a popular one to a less popular one, at least less popular in modern times, in a mainline game nonetheless. Not that this is that big of a surprise if you've been a Yakuza fan for a while, since the series always followed the JRPG logic of random encounters, shopping for items and equipment, leveling up based on player choice, and even dungeons. It just gave it a slick cinematic presentation and streamlined some elements. In other words, it simply keeping the same but changing to turn-based isn't as big of a deal as it might seem at first to an outsider, which means it is slightly more, but not as much as you might think of a bold move, than the God of War switch. So what was the deal with my opening paragraph? Well, I think Sony exclusives had it good for too long, so I wanted to dunk on them. Sorry about that. Let's talk about Yakuza Like a Dragon then, the first game of a franchise with a long storied history of being Sony exclusives until they weren't, and now this one is apparently a poster boy for Xbox of all things. I swear Microsoft isn't paying me to do this review, but they totally can if they want to.
Game over, yeah!
The story of Yakuza Like a Dragon, which I will just be calling Yakuza 7 from now on because that's what it is in Japan, it begins in 1999. Well, actually it begins much earlier with a cast of characters of which we won't know the true relevance of until 30 hours into the game, as it is the Yakuza tradition, but the first time we are actually in control of a character is when we take control of Ichiban Kasuga on the New Year's Eve of 1999. Compared to the series' previous protagonist, Kazuma Kiryu, Ichiban couldn't be more different personality-wise. While Kiryu began his story in a position of power and respect, and he had a distinct serious charm that he kept throughout all of the many iterations of Yakuza, Ichiban is a lovable fool who loves Dragon Quest and who begins his story at the bottom of the ladder. He is a small-time foot soldier, the likes of which Kiryu has punched to almost non-life for as long as he breathed, but he has a heart of gold, trying to see the best in people and to complete his dirty work while causing as little trouble as possible to those involved. He is also deeply devoted to Masato Arakawa, the patriarch of his family, who once saved his life. And thus, when right on New Year's Eve of all days, his family's captain ends up shooting dead a high-ranking member of another faction, Arakawa asks Ichi if he could take the heat and go to prison, and Ichi being Ichi promptly agrees and ends up spending the next 18 years of his life in the hopes of protecting his captain and coming back to the Yakuza as soon as he can. In true Yakuza tradition, the moment he gets out, he discovers things were not as they seemed, that times have wildly changed as he missed essentially the entire storyline of the previous games, and that the boss he respects as a father has in fact betrayed him before shooting him and leaving him to die on a ditch. Tough luck. Now poor Ichiban has to gather allies and climb back from rock bottom if he wants to find out what really happened 18 years ago. And let me tell you, the story of this game is a doozy. Apparently, every single writer of the entire studio came together to write it, and from the very opening scene I was hooked. The sequence of events from prologue to when the game properly starts is incredibly long, but also incredibly engaging, and probably one of my favorite gaming openings of all time, and is also one of the darkest and most brutal ones. I'm not gonna lie, Yakuza 7 might have one of the darkest stories in this franchise. I didn't play every single game that on this franchise, I played every single English game, except for the Kiwami ones, remakes, and some of the ones that only came in Japan. I didn't port some of them, but from what I played, this might be one of the darkest stories in the franchise, really. And from the get-go, you are shown a lot of really unpleasant stuff, from parental neglect to brutal violence, and this one doesn't shy away from the darkest aspects of the criminal underworld and the people embroiled in it, and I feel like I should warn anyone that stuff gets really heavy in this one. And I have to admit, I absolutely loved the story and got really engaged with it, but if there is at least one aspect of it that I didn't like, it was the pacing. It was how it simply hit the brakes when it properly starts, with Ichiban hitting the lowest point of his life, and from that, we must accompany him as he slowly climbs up through a series of seemingly unrelated events that are actually building a setup for a payback during the game's excellent finale. But when I say slowly climb back up, I do mean slowly. It is so slow that even when things were picking up, I sometimes wondered why was Ichiban even doing whatever he was currently doing, because it has been a while since, you know, the side points hit the main plot. And unfortunately there are also quite a few instances of characters going to do something only for something to completely fail, only for that something that they were trying to do to completely fail, or to barely even start before another plot point that's actually important and can help them move on comes along, which makes the 20 minutes of effort or so that you've just done feel completely worthless. But hey, at least it was only 20 minutes, until the next time the game wants you to waste 20 minutes before it properly goes along again. I have no idea why they decided to do that, really. And it is a bit of a shame that the middle of the game doesn't deliver the same highs as the opening and the ending. I mean, it does have some highs, it just never really hits the high of the opening and the ending. But damn if that opening and ending aren't some of the best of the entire franchise and of a lot of different franchises. They're just so good. I actually kind of feel bad for the game having to top itself. And the entire story does feel more cohesive the more it goes on, as the pieces slowly start falling into place. And what I'm trying to say is, other games in the franchise did a better job of making the process of searching for the pieces interesting in and of itself, while Yakuza 7 can sometimes make you feel like you're just walking until plot happens. But when plot happens, it happens beautifully. The best it ever did in the entire franchise. In the meantime though, you at least have plenty of cool characters in your main party to get invested into. You get Namba, the homeless, middle-aged ex-nurse guy who fights with an umbrella and is generally just too tired of the shit. Adachi, an almost elderly police officer with a vendetta against the current superintendent for stepping on innocent lives on his path to the top. And even Saiko, a former cabaret club employee who, with family troubles, who's currently searching for justice for the murder of her boss together with the rest of the party. There are of course other party members, but they are big spoilers, so I'll let you figure them out by yourself as you play the game. And by big spoilers, I mean they completely spoil them in the cover for the Japanese version of the game with little regard, which is why I recommend you don't Google the Japanese cover, Google the American one instead. I have to say, this rarely happens, but the Western cover for Yakuza 7 is just so much better than the Japanese cover. The Japanese cover looks so much more generic, tough guys looking, while the American cover does have all of the characters looking towards the player, but it just does a much better job of carrying forward, you know, the theme, the way this game feels, you know. And I just completely forgot the original point I was talking about while talking about the cover. Oh yes, I was talking about the party members. And when they are not out fighting in the mean streets, the party members with Ichiban, then Ichiban can bond with them over drinks, hearing about their troubles and trying to help them, slowly unlocking new abilities and jobs as you get to know their own individual backstories. Like, you know, a lot of modern Western RPGs actually, and also Persona! Oh yeah, we avoided touching on that game for so long, but I guess like death and other things in life, Persona is simply inevitable, huh? But in short, the main crew is great, and their personalities, backgrounds, and the way they interact with each other is very unique compared to other JRPGs, so I love them. Everybody knows that a JRPG story is deeply tied to the quality of the party members, and in that sense, there are few JRPGs out there with party members that are as unique and deeply realized as these, so I wholeheartedly approve of Ichiban and his merry band of brawling buddies. Story is just one half of an RPG, however. The other half is gameplay and art direction, but mostly gameplay, so let's get right down to the gritty details of it. Yakuza 7 ditches the series' previous simple 3D brawler gameplay for an equally simple turn-based style. Each character can do a basic attack, use a skill in exchange for MP, guard against attacks, or access an etc. menu from which they can use an item or tag out with another inactive party member, since you can only have 4 characters out in the field at any given time. And there is of course a run button, and Ichiban only has the exclusive option to access the Pound Mates option, where he can, for a price, summon a character to give a hand in the current battle, though each individual summon has different rules attached to them. Some summons, for example, can only be used during the day, and every summon, regardless of the condition, has a cooldown period before they can be used again. It's a simple setup, with equally simple gimmicks like status effects like poison and paralysis, elemental weaknesses and resistances, and attack types that mirror exactly how they work in other JRPGs. That's not necessarily a bad thing, especially considering how this is the team's first foray into turn-based territory, and keeping it simple and building a stable foundation to be used in future games is a good path to take, especially when everything is dressed in the usual satisfying Yakuza brawling that makes every punch feel like a truck hitting a brick wall. And as a plus, the combat isn't entirely turn-based. Instead, it takes a Mario and Luigi approach, where you can hit buttons during skills to cause extra damage and press the guard button during enemy attacks to negate most of the damage, so there are still real-time elements mixed in. Not that I dislike turn-based elements, I really do love turn-based gameplay. I'm just saying that it's good that they throw the spice into the mix, given that the turn-based gameplay doesn't do anything special particular to this game, but I still love turn-based gameplay. Please, turn-based people, I'm one of your friends, don't hit me. While the combat mostly hits the nail right on the head and is very satisfying, I do have 2 big problems with it. The first one is positioning. Positioning matters in combat. If you attack a character with an item nearby, the attacking character will pick up the item and hit with it for extra damage. If you try to attack an enemy and the enemy you're trying to attack is too far away from your character, there is a risk that another enemy will interrupt you mid-run and block your attack. And if a character is down on the ground, you can quickly attack him or her, him basically, since this is Yakuza, quickly for extra damage before he gets up. The problem with all of this is that positioning is completely random. Our characters constantly move back and forth to the scenery up to a certain distance from the original positioning, but you can't manually reposition your character. This means that whether your current party member will use an item to attack is completely up to chance, and even worse is when the AI bugs out and a character you could have hit while he's down for extra damage gets up before the party member AI can figure out how to get to him, and that's just frustrating. And that's just sad, because if you could manually reposition your character, or had skills that could change enemy position when used, that would already have shot the complexity of the combat through the ceiling, especially since all of the elements that could make positioning strategic are already in the game. They just shortly missed the mark by so little. I believe they could have easily implemented movement by either making the game run on active turn-based combat, so the player couldn't just abuse it to constantly move near items before attacking, since you know the enemies would be constantly loading their own attacks, or since that might have made things too hectic, especially since you fight big enemy groups, perhaps they could have made so that you have to use a turn to move, so movement would still be a factor that you could count in your strategy, but it wouldn't tip the scales too much towards the player side. As it stands though, it's just sad that they didn't even consider all of the different ways movement could have made this into a much better game. The second problem I have is that area skills are just plain unpredictable. There are two types of skill range, skills that only hit one enemy and skills that hit all enemies in a certain area, but unfortunately area is too broad of a term for what they actually do. Some area skills have the party member running in a straight line, other area skills use the term too generally and will only actually hit one enemy and maybe another one if they are really close together. Other area skills just hit all of the enemies in the area, and those are frankly the most reliable, though they are usually very expensive to use constantly. And finally, some seem to be completely up to chance whether they will hit or not. The problem lies with the fact that you are not shown a preview of what area the skills will actually hit, nor a target on all of the enemies that will be hit, and don't forget everyone is constantly shuffling around like some hyper-energetic Nintendo Idol sprites, so even if you do know who is going to get hit, chances are they will move away from the target area before the skill actually hits. It's absolutely frustrating trying to factor in area skills into your combat strategy when they are just this unreliable. That's just for the base combat itself though, that there are other areas that operate on a level around the combat that bring a better level of complexity and strategy to the combat without being part of the combat itself, namely the ever-present JRPG preparation. You can prepare by buying healing items, equipment, or even crafting equipment as well, but by far the most complex choice you can make is what job each party member will have. Jobs act like classes, and of course you change them on the job agency because where else would you? Each party member's job level differs from his character level, and each job level they get increases their stats and has the potential to unlock a new skill. Be warned, however, that your total stats is a sum of your job level and your character level, and thus changing jobs means your stats will also decrease until you change your character back to a higher level job, or you level this job to the level of the job you were previously using. As far as I noticed, and I could be wrong, but as far as I noticed, there is little benefit for constant job switching. At each job level up, the current job might give a small permanent stat boost, and each job has two skills that when unlocked will be available regardless of what the current job of the character is. So it's not like there is no use for job switching, it's just that the benefits are kind of small, but still useful in particular situations. My recommendations is to try to unlock as many attack skills of each elemental type as possible for your party, since you'll never know when you need them to get the advantage in a particular battle. But once you get what you want, it's better if you stick around with a single job throughout most of the game to get the most out of it. Personally, my party was mostly made up of characters simply using the original jobs that come with them, which only each individual character has. Like for example, Ichiban can be a musician and every single other male party member, since yes, jobs are also divided by gender, but each party member that is of a certain gender can use all of the jobs of that gender, but they also come with a job that is exclusive to that character, and each job really that they come with is already really balanced for a perfectly good balanced party. It is balanced for balanced, what can I say? Except for Psycho, who I always kept on my party, but I always kept her at the idol job instead of her original job, so she could serve as the party's dedicated healer. But yeah, most of the time I felt like it was better to get the skills that I wanted and just turn back to each character's original job. And whoo boy, you will need a dedicated healer. While the average drunk idiot on the street poses little threat, Yakuza 7 has some of the hardest JRPG bosses I have ever faced. They have giant pools of health that you can do little but chip away at, and they can go for multiple turns before any of your party members, and if you're unlucky, they can target all of those turns towards a particular one, which almost assures a KO before you even got a chance to fight back. And even if they don't, they can easily drop multiple party members to almost nothing of health, which pretty much makes having a dedicated healer an absolute necessity to surviving them. This is, without exaggeration, the hardest Yakuza game I've ever played. I had to constantly watch as my party went from almost dead to fully healed to almost dead to fully healed constantly, while the bosses laughed at my face and I wasn't even halfway through the battle, through their own health bars. Holy shit, it's hard. And I know that the developers knew that this game is hard, and probably intended that because also for the first time ever in the series, the game has no easy mode option, meaning having players pass through all of this is absolutely the experience intended by the developers. And I respect that, but at the same time, I feel like it was a bit of a weird one too. Yakuza has never been known for being hard games, and every single aspect of this game, from the minigames to the plot, is still distinctly Yakuza except for the main combat. So if any game in the series needed an easy mode so people could experience the rest of it without bothering much with the combat, it is this one. Yet, this is the first game in the series to completely forgo this option. Very weird. Doesn't affect me much since I've always played the series on normal because I felt like that was the intended experience, but I still feel I should warn potential buyers about this, and also that normal for this game, which is the first difficulty option available, is a lot of a hell harder than the normal for the other Yakuza games. One thing about the difficulty that I absolutely dislike though are the number spikes. Not difficulty spikes, number spikes. Because you see, Yakuza 7 took a bit too much inspiration from Dragon Quest, and that includes the occasional stat-induced difficulty spikes. You'll know when you meet them, when no matter how much strategy you apply, you get destroyed by sheer numbers. And when that happens, you have little choice but to grind for more levels and better equipment, and here's the really bad part of it. The places where you grind are called underground dungeons, in keeping with the Dragon Quest theme. But they are pretty much just sewers. Very long, very boring, very samey sewers. However, the higher level enemies and the materials to craft better weapons are there, so you have pretty much little choice but to venture there to grind it out until you are at an appropriate level, and it is just so boring. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that you are smarter than me, and you do figure out the strategy to deal with every single storyline, dungeon and boss battle. Which admittedly, you don't need to do anything for the sake of an argument. You probably are smarter than me. It isn't a very high bar to clear, I'm sorry to say, for myself. But anyway, the main story will still bring you to the dungeon, and will still make you go through a multiple hour run through it that just brings the story to a screeching halt. It's honestly just so fucking bad. There are no cutscenes, there is no context, they just drop you there and you just keep going, and every time you go up one floor and you're like, I'm closer to getting out, the next step to continue through the dungeon makes you go back down one floor, and it's just obligatory battle after boring shit with absolutely no story on site, with absolutely no interesting encounters. It is honestly completely awful, and I just had to open my heart and get this out of there. Oh god, it is trash. It is absolutely trash, and you have to go through it. I have no idea what they were thinking. No other place in the game is this boring. No other place is not fun. Even if the combat is basic, the encounters and the enemies and the situations you go through are just really good, really fun. And then there's the sewers, and they are easily the worst part of the entire game. And it's almost like it was developed by a completely different team, and there's just absolutely no fun to be had there. So, let's forget it ever happened then, and instead focus on a much more positive aspect of the game, the soundtrack. Every Yakuza game has great tracks, but holy shit, Yakuza 7 definitely has my favorite soundtrack of all of them. This game just keeps throwing amazing 100% certified bangers, one after another. There is not a single bad boss battle theme in the entire OST, and when they bring back and remix old songs for some familiar cameos, it just reaches the apex of perfection. Not to mention the karaoke songs, of which every party member gets at least one of, including of course some old reliable tracks, and overall it's just an absolutely amazing soundtrack, and the team really knocked it out of the park in this aspect. Graphics wise, this game is great. Yakuza has always been one of those series with great graphics for the time it was released, but since it was never a true worldwide AAA franchise, it never really had the bleeding edge cool technology other games had. It just had guts, a team who cares, and more importantly, the willingness to recycle assets whenever possible. Still, it's crazy to live in a world where I can't tell the difference between pre-rendered cutscenes and in-engine ones whenever they start. I always have to wait until the characters start speaking, since familiar animations and odd camera angles were more reliable telltale signs of what I was about to witness than the graphics themselves, which to me at least is honestly very impressive. They've really mastered the Dragon engine that started with Yakuza 6. Yes, there were other games between 6 and 7, it's just how it works. But anyway, in terms of art direction though, I have to admit I always liked stylized graphics instead of realistic ones, and even when realistic I prefer them to have a very unique art direction to them, such as the beautiful samurai world of Ghost of Tsushima, but there is a very distinct flashy style to combat this time around, which is heavily stylized, and Yakuza has always had like stylized combats with the heat flames when Kiryu entered heat mode and such, but this time there are sparkles and effects everywhere, so many effects. My FPS actually dropped at some points to the point where I couldn't time the attack correctly because of how many effects were on the screen, though I was less frustrated about it and more amused at how many effects they tried to shove in, how many particles they shoved in the attacks. But even outside of combat, one of Yakuza's biggest strengths is its approach to fictionalizing real places, which with such accuracy and density of detail that some people have even called it a virtual tourism of Japan's coolest places. Which, you know, it's not entirely, I don't know if you could say it's about Japan's coolest places, it's all about there's always a reason for them to be there story-wise, and the place might not be the most interesting in Japan, but it is always portrayed with accuracy and density. And that might not do much if you are living in Japan itself, surrounded by all of, you know, Japan. But to the surprise of no one, I'm not living in Japan, and thus modern Japan's Japanesness becomes an aesthetic of its own, divided from the world I usually inhabit, which is fancy speak for it's virtual tourism, basically. It's virtual tourism. And that's, I have to admit, I've kind of grown fond of it as the series went on, and I think it is its own aesthetic sense. Yeah, I like it. I like it. Of course, if you look really closely, you can still see buildings going into buildings, and also buildings floating in a sea of darkness, but I suppose you weren't supposed to pay too much attention to those details, so let's move on. And of course, we need to save a segment of this video only for the minigames. Yakuza 7, like every other game in the series, is absolutely loaded with side quests and minigames. You can go to karaoke, you can play some baseball at the battling center, you can play Sega classics at the arcade, which is still one of my favorite parts of this franchise because I played so many Sega classics for the first time at an arcade in a Yakuza game, and much more. Though two minigames in particular stand out as having a lot more effort put into them than the others. You can even access information about them at any time from the main menu, that's how important they are. And that's the Dragon Kart minigame and the Management minigame. In Dragon Kart, as you might have imagined by the name, Ichiban gets to go Mario Karting around the streets, and it really is the complete package, with booster pads and support items you can pick up during the race to really bring the pain to your opponents, not to mention the legendary drifting that you can only really pull in kart games. Beyond just racing, you can unlock new karts as you progress through the kart racing storyline, because of course there is a kart racing storyline, and you can also upgrade each individual kart as well to give you an edge on the races. The Management minigame, however, is where you spend the most of your minigame time, by far, since it is a long and involved business simulator where Ichiban must take a senbei shop and turn it into a commercial powerhouse. And yes, I know it's going to get kind of complex right now since I'm going to explain everything about this minigame, but trust me, it's basically a completely separate game on its own. I have to basically explain it. Okay, so you can hire employees which work in a gacha style system where each one of them is assigned a rarity level to them, and the rarer the employee, the harder it is to get them, but also the higher their stats as well. And you must treat them well, training them to level them up before promoting them to break the level cap, pretty much in the same scheme like a mobile gacha game. If you played one of those, you know what I'm talking about. But unlike a mobile gacha game though, your employees can get mad at you and try to leave if you don't offer them a raise, and you must also give them paid vacations to better their mood, so you also have to watch out for that. It's not only people that you have to take care of, however, you must also take care of locations. Basically, you must also manage the stores where your employees will work on. Beyond the senbei shop that you start with, you can also get bookstores, art galleries, and even brothels, each with their own level in 3 different stats. Your objective is to upgrade the sales volume of each shop so that they will increase profit. But each time you raise the sales volumes, you must also have a minimal amount of each stat to truly maximize sales. And that's where your employees come in, because they all have their own level of each of the 3 stats that can be used to improve the store stats. However, only the leader of the location will contribute to all 3 stats. The other 2 employees, since there's a 3 employee maximum per store, will contribute only to a single stat, thus making employees that are only good at 1 stat just as valuable as employees with balanced stats. They just have a different niche. And of course, you can also level up each individual stat on the stores themselves, but each store has a different limit of how much they can level it up, each stat. So you have to set up your employees to make up for each store's individual weaknesses carefully. And if all of that sounds more complicated and intimidating than the game's main combat itself, well, that's because it actually is, and could be a game in and of itself. But let's not think too much about it, because we still have one big element of this minigame to cover. After setting everything up, you must press the go button to see how well your stores fare during the next sales period. And after every 4 sales periods, you must go to a shareholders conference, in which Ichiban must bring his brightest employees to the table in order to essentially shout down the busybody investors with the power of words. Each shareholder has a time limit until they start asking questions, but you can allow them a chance yourself, at which point a brightly colored speech bubble will appear and you must choose an employee that has a better color than it in a rock, paper, scissor color scheme thing to break his argument, at which point the investor will switch to a different color of the fence, and you can once again switch to another employee that's strong against that color to shout him down into satisfaction. All of your attacks cost a number of points that all come from the same points pool that slowly regenerates during the meeting, because all of this is running in real time, and in order to win the meeting, you must either convince all of the shareholders to be on your side, or at least get more than 50% of the room on your side before the timer runs out. Also, I should mention that in case of emergency, Ichiban can break out his secret weapon, which is a slowly charging hyper attack in which he profusely apologizes to the shareholders, which temporarily locks their timers and increases your power points from your power points pool. But enough about describing all of the zany stuff. You probably want my genuine opinion on it, instead of just a description of the gameplay. And just like I warned at the beginning of the segment, I gotta say I really like it, but there is really no other way for you to know just how deep the rabbit hole goes without me describing it fully. And honestly, the description alone will tell you how complex and fun this piece of side content really is. There is not much of it that is like hidden. Just describing it will allow you to know instantly if this minigame is your thing or not your thing, but at least I hope it goes to show just how much effort the Yakuza team puts into the side content of their games, and that's why the side content has become one of the defining features of the Yakuza franchise. Though I also have to admit that if there's something I disliked, is that when eventually you figure everything out, everything of the nuances of this and all of the weird stuff, that how it works, and it might not be intuitive at first, but when you figure that out and you make the optimal business plan, there is little to do but to press the play button over and over again until you're rolling in cash and the story portion of the minigame comes to an end, which is really repetitive and there's basically no gameplay at that point, just keep pressing go. Then again, I also played the entire side quest the moment it was unlocked in one go, and that's probably not the intended way to play it, so oops on my part. On the other hand, it did make me massively rich right out of the gate, which is great since at least I didn't need to grind cash along with the other stuff that I needed to grind. But still, it was a blast, and honestly that sums up my feelings toward the Yakuza 7. It's not the best game ever made or a super turbo masterpiece, it is very flawed, but it is still a blast, and it has all of the characteristics of a new series that is still trying to find its footing, since, well, you know, it has been a major change in the franchise, but it is still a recognizable part of a franchise. It still has the backbone of previous Yakuza games to help prop it up into something much more special than a simple work in progress, and it's what makes this entire thing simply work together. It's the glue that holds it all together, that the development team at Ryuga Gotoku Studio already has in mind, and because they basically developed it over more than 10 installments, and at this point they already know what to do with it, and that's what elevates it beyond a good but flawed start to a franchise into a truly great game that's just trying to find its footing in this brand new world that is trying to explore. And while I'd honestly recommend first-time players to begin with 0 or Kiwami 1, or if you are a really good person, you will begin just like me with the original on the PS2, but if that's not available to you, then 0 or Kiwami 1 are good. But those already invested in this series should find much to enjoy in Yakuza 7. If you're worried about the sudden gameplay change, don't be, because it might be basic because they have to put all of the bells and whistles still, but it's still very polished and very good. And here's hoping that they bring further improvements to the combat, the bells and whistles that I just talked about, in future games instead of stagnating, because it would be a shame to waste the foundation built in this title, since it is rock solid, like a dragon. Wait, that makes no sense. That's nonsense. Did I write this? What the f? So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching to the very end. Please remember to subscribe, like, dislike, leave a fan comment, leave a hate comment, call the FBI, call the CIA, call the Pentagon, tell them that this video is completely garbage, someone gotta know, but please do anything to up the engagement so YouTube will recommend the good word of Yakuza to more people. Yeah, that's it. See you guys next time.